The little girl who wouldn't give up. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Buckingham Palace as thousands of tourists gathered for the changing of the guard ceremony. Among the crowd stood 6-year-old Emma Thompson, clutching her mother's hand tightly while wearing a bright red coat that matched the guards' uniforms. Her eyes sparkled with excitement as she watched the tall, imposing figures in their distinctive bearskin hats march with perfect precision. Emma had been fascinated by the royal guards ever since her grandmother told her stories about their unwavering dedication and discipline. She had saved her pocket money for months to buy a small toy guard figure, which she carried everywhere. Today was special because it was her birthday, and her parents had brought her to London specifically to see the real guards. As the ceremony began, Emma noticed one particular guard standing at attention near the palace gates. His name was Sergeant James Mitchell, though Emma didn't know this. What she did know was that this guard seemed different somehow. While his face remained stern and expressionless like all the others, there was something gentle about his eyes that caught her attention. The ceremony proceeded flawlessly, with each guard moving in perfect synchronization. The tourists snapped photos and marveled at the discipline displayed before them. Emma watched in wonder, completely mesmerized by the spectacle. When the ceremony concluded, most of the crowd began to disperse, but Emma remained rooted to her spot. She had heard that the guards never broke character, never smiled, and never acknowledged the tourists. This only made her more determined. Emma believed that somewhere beneath that stoic exterior was a person who might appreciate a simple gesture of kindness. She reached into her small backpack and pulled out a drawing she had made the night before. It showed a stick figure guard with a big smile, surrounded by hearts and rainbows. Her mother tried to convince her that the guards wouldn't be able to respond, but Emma was persistent. She approached Sergeant Mitchell slowly, her little legs carrying her across the courtyard with determination that surprised even her parents. The guard stood motionless, his eyes fixed straight ahead as protocol demanded. Emma stopped just a few feet away from the towering figure and held up her drawing. She spoke in her sweetest voice, wishing the guard a happy day and telling him that she thought guards were the bravest people in the world. She explained that she had drawn the picture especially for guards like him because they work so hard to protect everyone. For several minutes, nothing happened. The guard maintained his position, and Emma continued to hold up her drawing, her small arms beginning to tire. Other tourists began to notice the scene, some taking photos of the determined little girl and the unmovable guard. Emma's parents grew concerned and tried to call her back, but she shook her head firmly. "Please, Mr. Guard," she said softly. "I made this just for you. My grandmama says guards have big hearts even if they can't show them. I want you to know that someone thinks you're special." What Emma didn't know was that Sergeant Mitchell was fighting an internal battle. He had been serving as a royal guard for 8 years and had never once broken protocol. He took immense pride in his duty and the tradition he represented. However, something about this little girl's innocent persistence was touching a part of his heart that he had trained himself to ignore while on duty. The other guards nearby were also watching, though they couldn't turn their heads. They could see their colleagues' internal struggle and understood the weight of the moment. Breaking character wasn't just about personal discipline. It could result in serious consequences for their careers. As minutes passed, more tourists gathered to watch the standoff between the small girl and the tall guard. Some whispered among themselves about the touching scene, while others wondered if the guard would maintain his composure. Emma's parents approached cautiously, not wanting to embarrass their daughter, but also concerned about the attention she was drawing. Emma's arms were getting tired, but her determination never wavered. She began talking to the guard about her birthday, her new dress, and how she had practiced standing still like a guard in her bedroom. She told him about her toy guard, and how she made up stories about brave soldiers who protected castles and princesses. The guard's eyes, which had been staring straight ahead, began to show the slightest hint of movement. Almost imperceptibly, his gaze shifted downward toward the little girl. It was a movement so subtle that most observers wouldn't have noticed, but Emma did. She saw the change in his eyes and smiled even brighter. "I knew you could see me," she whispered excitedly. "You don't have to say anything. I just wanted you to know that you're doing a really good job." The crowd around them had grown larger, and people were beginning to murmur about what they were witnessing. Some visitors from other countries were amazed by the child's boldness, while others were curious about whether this situation had ever happened before. Emma's mother finally approached and gently placed her hand on her daughter's shoulder. She explained that they needed to let the guard continue his work, but Emma wasn't ready to give up. She had come this far and felt certain that her gesture of kindness would be acknowledged, even if it was in the smallest way possible. The tension in the air was palpable as everyone waited to see how this heartwarming encounter would conclude. The guard remained perfectly still, but those watching closely could sense that something significant was happening beneath the surface of his professional composure. This moment would become the first of several incidents that day where the rigid traditions of the Royal Guard would be tested by simple human kindness, setting the stage for a series of heartwarming encounters that would remind everyone present that even the most disciplined soldiers are, at their core, human beings capable of compassion and warmth. The veteran's silent salute. 3 hours after Emma's encounter, the afternoon shift brought new guards to their positions around the palace grounds. Among them was Corporal David Hayes, a decorated veteran who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before joining the Royal Guard. His military bearing was impeccable, and his dedication to duty was legendary among his peers. The tourist crowds had swelled during the lunch hour, with families from around the world gathering to witness the pageantry of British tradition. Street performers entertained nearby, vendors sold postcards and souvenirs, and the atmosphere buzzed with excitement and cultural exchange. Among the visitors was an elderly man named Robert Chen, who moved slowly through the crowd with the aid of a walking stick. At 82 years old, Robert had traveled from his home in California to fulfill a promise he had made to his late wife. She had always dreamed of visiting London and seeing the Royal Guards, but illness had prevented their planned trip years earlier. Robert wore a simple blue jacket, but pinned to his chest was a small medal that caught the sunlight as he walked. It was his World War II service medal, earned during his time in the Pacific Theater as a young Marine. Most people passing by didn't notice the decoration, but Robert wore it with quiet pride, especially on days when he visited places that honored military service. As Robert approached the area where Corporal Hayes stood guard, he moved more slowly than the other tourists. His age made walking difficult, and the cobblestones were uneven beneath his feet. He paused frequently to catch his breath, but his determination to complete this pilgrimage for his beloved wife kept him moving forward. When Robert finally reached a position about 10 feet from the guard, he stopped and steadied himself with his walking stick. For a long moment, he simply observed the young soldier, taking in the crisp uniform, the perfect posture, and the unwavering focus that reminded him of his own military service decades earlier. Other tourists continued to move around them, taking photos and chatting excitedly, but Robert remained still. He understood the discipline required to stand motionless for hours, the mental strength needed to ignore distractions, and the honor that came with serving one's country. These were experiences that created an invisible bond between soldiers across generations and nationalities. Slowly and carefully, Robert raised his weathered right hand to his forehead in a perfect military salute. His movements were deliberate and respectful, executed with the same precision he had learned as a young recruit 7 decades earlier. The gesture was clean and professional, unmistakably the salute of a veteran who had never forgotten his training. Corporal Hayes, whose eyes had been trained to notice every detail of his surroundings while maintaining his forward gaze, immediately recognized what was happening. The sight of the elderly veteran's salute struck him deeply. Here was a man who had served his country with honor, now paying his respects to a current soldier despite their different nationalities and the many years between their service. The moment created a powerful connection that transcended the formal protocols of the Royal Guard. Hayes felt the weight of military tradition and the respect that flowed between warriors of different eras. His training had prepared him for many situations, but this genuine display of soldier-to-soldier respect challenged his ability to remain unmoved. For 30 seconds, Robert maintained his salute, his arm steady despite his advanced age. The other tourists around him began to notice what was happening, and gradually the chatter in the immediate area grew quieter. People instinctively understood that they were witnessing something significant, even if they didn't fully comprehend the military traditions at play. Hayes felt every muscle in his body wanting to respond. Military courtesy demanded that a salute be returned, but his duty as a royal guard required him to remain motionless. The internal conflict was intense as his military training competed with his ceremonial obligations. The elderly veteran's eyes met those of the young guard, and in that moment, a conversation took place without words. Robert's expression conveyed understanding and respect, while Hayes' eyes showed appreciation and acknowledgement, even though his body remained perfectly still. As Robert slowly lowered his salute, he nodded slightly and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for your service, son." The words carried the weight of experience and the recognition of shared sacrifice that only those who have served can truly understand. The crowd around them had grown silent, sensing the gravity of the moment. Many visitors didn't fully understand what they had witnessed, but they recognized the emotion and respect that had passed between the two men. Some tourists wiped away tears, moved by the display of honor and tradition. Hayes's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly, the only sign of the emotional struggle taking place within him. Every fiber of his being wanted to return the salute and acknowledge the veteran's gesture, but his duty demanded absolute stillness. The moment tested not only his discipline but also his heart. Robert understood the guard's position and didn't expect a response. He had served long enough to know about duty and protocol. His salute hadn't been offered to receive acknowledgement, but to express respect and solidarity. With a gentle smile, he slowly turned and continued his walk through the palace grounds, his pilgrimage nearly complete. As the elderly veteran walked away, Hayes remained at attention, but something had fundamentally changed. The encounter had reminded him why he wore the uniform and what his service truly meant. It wasn't just about ceremony and tradition. It was about honor, respect, and the continuous line of service members who had dedicated their lives to protecting others. The tourists gradually returned to their normal activities, taking photos and exploring the area, but many remained subdued by what they had witnessed. The encounter between the veteran and the guard had provided them with a glimpse into the deeper meanings behind military service and the bonds that connect soldiers across time and nationality. This moment would become another testament to the power of respect and recognition, showing how even the most rigid military protocols could be touched by genuine human connection and mutual appreciation between those who had chosen to serve. The mother's desperate plea. The late afternoon sun was beginning to cast longer shadows across the palace courtyard when Sarah Martinez approached the guard station with her 3-year-old son, Miguel, in her arms. Sarah had been visiting London for her sister's wedding, and the day at the palace was meant to be a fun tourist activity. However, what should have been a pleasant family outing was quickly turning into every parent's nightmare. Miguel had been fussy and difficult all day, refusing to nap and becoming increasingly agitated as the hours passed. By the time they reached Buckingham Palace, the little boy was in full meltdown mode, crying inconsolably and struggling against his mother's attempts to comfort him. Sarah tried everything she could think of, offering snacks, toys, and distractions, but nothing seemed to work. The tourists around them began to stare and whisper, some with understanding sympathy, others with barely concealed annoyance at the disruption. Sarah felt her cheeks burning with embarrassment as she tried to quiet her son while also managing their diaper bag and camera. She was visiting from Spain and felt particularly self-conscious about drawing attention in a foreign country. Standing nearby was Lance Corporal Thomas Wright, a 26-year-old guard who had been on duty for nearly 2 hours. Wright was known among his colleagues for his excellent discipline and his ability to remain focused even in challenging situations. He had younger siblings back home and understood how difficult it could be to manage upset children, but his duty required him to maintain his position regardless of the distractions around him. As Miguel's crying intensified, Sarah became increasingly desperate. She had tried walking away from the crowd, changing his diaper, offering him water, and singing softly to him, but nothing helped. The little boy seemed inconsolable, and his cries were echoing off the palace walls, drawing even more unwanted attention. Other tourists began to move away from the area, clearly frustrated by the noise. Some made comments loud enough for Sarah to hear, suggesting that she should take her child elsewhere. The criticism only made Sarah more anxious, which seemed to make Miguel cry even harder. She felt trapped and overwhelmed, unsure of what to do next. In her desperation, Sarah noticed the tall guard standing motionless nearby. She had heard that these soldiers were trained to ignore everything around them, but something about his steady presence seemed comforting in the chaos of her situation. Without thinking clearly, she approached Lance Corporal Wright with her crying son. "Please," she said in accented English, her voice breaking with emotion. "I don't know what to do. He won't stop crying, and everyone is staring at us. I'm sorry to bother you, but I just need a moment to figure this out." Wright remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed straight ahead as required by protocol. However, he could hear the genuine distress in the mother's voice and the exhaustion in her son's cries. As the oldest of 4 children, he had extensive experience with upset toddlers and recognized the signs of a child who was overwhelmed and overstimulated. Sarah stood there for a moment, holding her crying son, hoping that somehow the guard's calm presence might help settle Miguel. She wasn't asking him to break protocol or speak to them. She simply needed a quiet space to collect herself and try to comfort her child. The other tourists continued to watch, some taking photos of the scene, which only added to Sarah's embarrassment. She began to cry herself, feeling overwhelmed by the situation and the public scrutiny. Miguel's crying seemed to escalate in response to his mother's distress, creating a cycle that she couldn't break. Wright could see the mother's shoulders shaking as she tried to comfort her son. His military training had taught him to remain focused on his duties, but his human instincts were telling him that here was someone who truly needed help. The sight of the upset mother and child was affecting him more than he had expected. As Sarah continued to struggle with Miguel, other tourists began to offer unsolicited advice. Some suggested she should leave immediately, while others recommended various parenting techniques. The well-meaning but overwhelming input from strangers only made Sarah feel more judged and anxious. Miguel, sensing his mother's distress and stimulated by all the attention and noise around him, cried even harder. His face was red and streaked with tears, and his small body trembled with the intensity of his emotions. Sarah felt helpless and began to consider cutting their visit short and returning to their hotel, though she wasn't sure that would solve the problem. Wright found himself focusing on the sound of the child's cries rather than maintaining his usual mental discipline. Despite his training, he couldn't ignore the distress of the people just a few feet away from him. The mother's quiet desperation and the child's obvious discomfort were creating an emotional situation that challenged his professional composure. The guard began to remember his own childhood experiences with his younger siblings. He recalled how his mother used to calm upset children, and the techniques that had worked when he helped babysit his nephews and nieces. There were simple methods that often worked when children became overstimulated in public places. Sarah noticed that despite all the noise and activity around them, the guard remained perfectly calm and steady. His breathing was even, his posture was relaxed despite being formal, and there was something about his presence that seemed to offer a sense of stability in the chaos she was experiencing. Without fully realizing what she was doing, Sarah began to mirror the guard's calm breathing pattern. As she focused on his steady composure, she found herself becoming slightly less anxious. Miguel, still crying but perhaps sensing a small change in his mother's energy, began to show the first signs of exhaustion. The moment was becoming a test, not just of Wright's professional discipline, but of his humanity. Here was a situation where his training as a soldier conflicted with his instincts as a caring person who had experience helping with upset children. The internal struggle was intense as he watched the mother and child continue to suffer just beyond his reach. This scene was setting the stage for what would become one of the most touching displays of compassion breaking through military protocol, as the guard faced a choice between duty and human kindness that would resonate with everyone present. The lost tourists guide as evening approached and the golden hour light began to bathe the palace grounds. A new situation was developing near the main entrance gates. An elderly Japanese couple, Hiroshi and Akiko Tanaka, stood looking confused and increasingly worried as they tried to navigate the busy tourist area with a paper map clutched in their hands. The Tanakas had been planning this trip to London for over 2 years, saving money and learning basic English phrases to help them communicate during their visit. At 78 and 75 years old, respectively, this was their first time traveling outside of Japan, and they had been both excited and nervous about the adventure. Their carefully planned itinerary had gone smoothly for the first few days, but today everything seemed to be going wrong. They had become separated from their tour group during the changing of the guard ceremony, and now they couldn't figure out where they were supposed to meet the bus that would take them back to their hotel. Standing at his post near the main gates was Guardsman Michael O'Connor, a native of Belfast who had joined the Royal Guard 3 years earlier. O'Connor spoke several languages, including some basic Japanese he had learned while stationed in Okinawa during an earlier military assignment. He was known among his colleagues for his quick wit and his ability to remain calm under pressure. Hiroshi approached several other tourists, trying to communicate in broken English and showing them a piece of paper with their hotel's name written in both Japanese and English characters. Most people tried to help, but the language barrier made communication difficult, and the directions they received were confusing and contradictory. Akiko became visibly upset as the minutes passed, worried that they would miss their bus and be stranded in an unfamiliar city where they could barely speak the language. She clutched her husband's arm tightly, and Hiroshi could see the fear in her eyes despite his attempts to remain calm and reassuring. The elderly couple eventually made their way closer to where Guardsman O'Connor was stationed. Hiroshi noticed the tall, uniformed figure and remembered that their tour guide had mentioned something about the guards being knowledgeable about the local area, though he also recalled being told that they wouldn't be able to help tourists with directions. Despite knowing that the guard probably wouldn't respond, Hiroshi was becoming desperate. His wife was clearly distressed. It was getting later in the day, and they had no idea how to find their way back to their hotel or locate their tour group. With nothing to lose, he approached O'Connor with the piece of paper containing their hotel information. "Excuse me," Hiroshi said in careful English, bowing slightly out of respect. "We are lost. Our hotel, we cannot find our group." He held up the paper hopefully, though he didn't really expect a response based on what he had observed about the guard's behavior. O'Connor's eyes remained fixed straight ahead, but he immediately recognized the Japanese characters on the paper and understood the couple's predicament. His training had taught him to ignore such requests, but he could see that these were elderly tourists who were genuinely lost and frightened, not people trying to get photos or test his discipline. Akiko began speaking rapidly in Japanese to her husband, clearly expressing her worry about their situation. Although most observers couldn't understand her words, her tone of distress was universal. She kept looking around anxiously, as if hoping to spot their tour guide or bus in the crowd of people. O'Connor could understand some of what Akiko was saying, and he realized that their situation was more serious than a simple request for directions. They were genuinely lost, had limited English skills, and were clearly becoming more frightened as time passed. His conscience began to struggle with his duty as he watched the elderly couple's distress intensify. Other tourists nearby began to notice the situation and tried to help, but the language barrier made effective communication nearly impossible. Well-meaning strangers offered conflicting directions and suggestions, which only added to the confusion and made Hiroshi and Akiko more anxious about their situation. The hotel name on their paper was familiar to O'Connor, and he knew exactly where it was located. He also knew the most direct route to get there and could easily provide clear directions that would help the couple find their way safely. The knowledge that he could solve their problem with just a few words made his enforced silence even more difficult to maintain. As the minutes passed, Akiko became more visibly upset, and Hiroshi's attempts to comfort her were becoming less effective. The stress of being lost in a foreign country where they couldn't communicate properly was overwhelming for both of them, and their advanced age made the situation even more challenging. O'Connor found himself thinking about his own grandparents and how he would want someone to help them if they found themselves in a similar situation abroad. The thought of these elderly tourists spending the night lost in London because he couldn't break protocol to give them simple directions was becoming increasingly difficult for him to accept. The couple tried asking several more tourists for help, but each interaction left them more confused and frustrated. The directions they received were inconsistent, and their limited English made it difficult for them to understand the explanations they were given. They began to look truly desperate. As the afternoon wore on, Hiroshi approached the guard one more time, this time with Akiko beside him. Both of them bowed respectfully and tried once again to explain their situation, showing the paper with their hotel information and using gestures to indicate that they were lost. Akiko's eyes were filled with tears, and her hands were shaking, slightly from anxiety. The sight of the frightened elderly couple standing before him, politely asking for help that he was fully capable of providing, created an intense internal conflict for O'Connor. His military discipline demanded that he maintain his position and ignore their request, but his humanity was screaming at him to help these vulnerable tourists who needed nothing more than simple directions to safety. This moment would prove to be another crucial test of the balance between duty and compassion, as the guard faced a decision that would reveal the fundamental humanity that exists even within the most rigid military traditions. The surprise reunion, the early evening brought a different kind of energy to the palace grounds as the day shift prepared to end and the evening ceremonies began. Among the gathering crowd was 28-year-old Lisa Crawford, who had traveled from Manchester with her 5-year-old daughter Sophie for what was supposed to be a surprise visit to see her husband. Lisa's husband, Guardsman Peter Crawford, was stationed at Buckingham Palace and had been serving as a royal guard for 18 months. Due to the demanding schedule and security protocols, Peter hadn't been able to see his family for over 6 weeks. Lisa had planned this surprise visit carefully, coordinating with Peter's commanding officer to ensure they could see him, even if only briefly. Sophie bounced excitedly beside her mother, wearing a small red dress that she had picked out especially for seeing her daddy. She carried a handmade card decorated with crayon drawings of guards and hearts, along with a small, stuffed bear that she wanted to give to her father. The little girl had been counting down the days until this visit and could barely contain her excitement. What Lisa didn't know was that there had been a last-minute schedule change, and Peter had been assigned to a different post than originally planned. Instead of being at the main entrance where she expected to find him, he was now stationed at the less prominent side entrance, a position that wasn't part of the public viewing areas. As they approached the main gates, Sophie began looking around eagerly for her father among the guards on duty. Lisa had shown her photographs to help her recognize Peter in uniform, but with the distinctive bearskin hats and formal uniforms, all the guards looked remarkably similar to a 5-year-old's eyes. "Where's Daddy?" Sophie asked repeatedly, tugging on her mother's hand and pointing at various guards. Lisa began to feel concerned as she realized that Peter wasn't where she had expected him to be. She tried calling his mobile phone, but guards on duty weren't allowed to answer personal calls. Standing at the main gate was Guardsman Anthony Reed, a colleague of Peter's who knew about the planned family visit. Reed had been looking forward to seeing his friend's reunion with his wife and daughter, but he realized that they were looking in the wrong place for Peter. Sophie became increasingly frustrated as she couldn't spot her father among the guards she could see. She began calling out, "Daddy, Daddy," in her clear, high-pitched voice, causing other tourists to smile at her enthusiasm while not understanding the situation. Lisa tried to explain to Sophie that they might need to wait or look in a different area, but the little girl was convinced that her father must be one of the guards they could see. She began approaching different guards, standing in front of them and asking, "Are you my daddy?" in the innocent way that only young children can. Reed watched this scene unfold with growing concern. He knew that Peter was stationed just around the corner at the side entrance, probably unaware that his family was looking for him. He also knew that Lisa and Sophie had traveled a long distance for this surprise visit, and that Peter would be heartbroken if he missed seeing them. The situation became more touching as Sophie's questions to the various guards grew more detailed. She began telling them about her drawing, her stuffed bear, and how much she missed her daddy. The other tourists found her innocence charming, but Reed could see Lisa's growing worry about not being able to find Peter. "My daddy is very tall, like you," Sophie told Reed directly, standing right in front of him with her card held high. "He wears the big hat and the red coat. He protects the queen, and he's the best guard in the whole world." Her pride in her father was evident in every word. Reed felt his heart breaking as he listened to the little girl's description of her father. He knew Peter well and was aware of how much he missed his family during his long assignments. Reed also knew that Peter carried Sophie's photograph in his uniform pocket and talked about her constantly during their off-duty hours. Lisa approached Reed and quietly explained their situation, hoping that perhaps he might be able to help them locate Peter or get a message to him. She spoke softly, not wanting to put the guard in a difficult position but desperate to make this surprise visit work for Sophie's sake. "I'm sorry to bother you," Lisa said politely, "but we're looking for my husband, Guardsman Peter Crawford. We've come from Manchester to surprise him, and I thought he would be stationed here, but I can't see him anywhere. Is there any way you could help us find him?" Reed's training demanded that he remain silent and motionless, but his loyalty to his fellow soldier and his compassion for the worried family created an intense internal struggle. He knew exactly where Peter was and could easily direct them to the correct location, but doing so would require him to break protocol. Sophie continued to talk to Reed, showing him her drawing and explaining all the details she had included. She pointed out the guard in her picture and explained that she had drawn a heart because guards had big hearts just like her daddy. Her innocent chatter was melting Reed's resolve with every word. The little girl then did something that nearly broke Reed's composure entirely. She reached up and gently touched his hand, looking up at his face with complete trust and hope. "Please help us find my daddy," she said simply. "I made this card for him, and I want to give him a big hug." Lisa watched her daughter's interaction with the guard and could see something changing in his expression. Even though he remained perfectly still, she sensed that this particular guard understood their situation and might be sympathetic to their plight, even if he couldn't openly help them. The moment was becoming increasingly emotional as other tourists began to realize what was happening. Some recognized the poignancy of a military family trying to reunite, while others were simply charmed by Sophie's determination to find her father among the guards. Reed was facing one of the most difficult decisions of his military career. His duty required him to maintain his post and remain silent, but his friendship with Peter and his compassion for the family were pushing him toward action that could have serious consequences for his career. This scene was building toward what would become one of the most heartwarming displays of military brotherhood and family devotion, as the bonds of friendship and compassion prepared to triumph over rigid protocol. The Dayharts conquered protocol as the sun began to set over London. The events of this extraordinary day reached their culmination. What had started as a routine day of ceremonial duties had become something much more significant for everyone involved. The rigid traditions of the Royal Guard had been tested repeatedly by genuine human emotions and needs, and the guards had faced impossible choices between duty and compassion. Sergeant Mitchell, still thinking about little Emma and her drawing, made a decision that would change everything. During a brief moment when no senior officers were in immediate view, he allowed the slightest smile to cross his face and gave Emma an almost imperceptible nod. The little girl's face lit up with joy, and she whispered, "Thank you," before running back to her parents with tears of happiness in her eyes. The moment didn't go unnoticed by other guards or tourists, and word began to spread quietly about what had happened. Rather than criticism, there was a growing sense of warmth and appreciation for the humanity that had been displayed. Meanwhile, Corporal Hayes, still moved by the elderly veteran's salute, found his own moment of connection. As Robert Chen prepared to leave the palace grounds, Hayes managed to shift his position just slightly and give the veteran the briefest possible return salute. It lasted only a fraction of a second, but it was enough to acknowledge the respect and service that had been offered to him. Lance Corporal Wright's situation with Sarah and little Miguel had also reached its resolution. Unable to stand by while the mother struggled with her crying child, Wright had begun to softly hum a lullaby that his own mother had sung to his younger siblings. The gentle sound, barely audible but consistent and soothing, had helped calm both Miguel and his mother. Sarah had been amazed as her son gradually settled down, sensing the peaceful presence nearby. Guardsman O'Connor faced perhaps the most challenging situation with the lost Japanese couple. Unable to speak directly to them, he had carefully and subtly used his eyes to indicate directions, looking deliberately toward the street they needed to take and then back to them. His subtle guidance, combined with the help of other tourists who had noticed his movements, eventually led the Tanakas to safety and their hotel. The most dramatic moment came when Guardsman Reed made his decision about Sophie and her search for her father. Unable to speak or leave his post, Reed had done something unprecedented. He had used his rifle to tap out a simple Morse code message on the ground, spelling out "side gate" to another guard who understood the code. That guard had then managed to alert a palisade about the situation. Within minutes, Guardsman Peter Crawford had been discreetly moved to a position where his family could see him. Sophie's scream of delight when she finally spotted her father had echoed across the courtyard, and even the most disciplined guards had found themselves fighting back smiles at the pure joy in her voice. The reunion had been brief but intensely emotional. While Peter couldn't break his formal stance, Sophie had been allowed to stand beside him for a few minutes while Lisa took photographs. The little girl had chattered constantly about her card and her stuffed bear, and although Peter couldn't respond verbally, his eyes had shown all the love and pride that words could never express. As news of these incidents spread among the guard units, something remarkable happened. Rather than facing disciplinary action, the guards found themselves receiving quiet support from their superiors. The commanding officers recognized that their men had faced extraordinary circumstances that required extraordinary responses. The tourists who had witnessed these events began sharing their stories and photographs on social media, and the posts quickly went viral around the world. People from different countries and cultures found themselves deeply moved by these displays of humanity, breaking through military protocol. Emma's mother posted the video of her daughter's interaction with Sergeant Mitchell, and it was viewed millions of times within hours. Comments poured in from viewers who were touched by the guards' gentle acknowledgement of the little girl's kindness. Many parents shared their own stories of their children's fascination with soldiers and guards, creating a global conversation about the human side of military service. The photograph of Robert Chen saluting Corporal Hayes became an iconic image, representing the respect and brotherhood shared between veterans across generations. Military veterans from around the world shared the image with their own stories of service and sacrifice, creating a powerful tribute to the bonds that connect all who have served their countries. Sarah's story about Wright's gentle humming to calm her crying son resonated with parents everywhere. The video showed the exact moment when Miguel stopped crying and began to settle down, capturing the power of simple human kindness to transform a difficult situation. Parenting groups shared the story as an example of how communities can support struggling families. The footage of the elderly Japanese couple being helped by O'Connor's subtle guidance touched viewers who had experienced similar situations while traveling. The video showed the moment when they finally understood the directions and the relief on their faces when they realized they would be able to find their way safely back to their hotel. But perhaps the most powerful story was Sophie's reunion with her father. The video of the little girl's excitement upon finding Peter, followed by their tender moment together despite the formal constraints of his duty, brought tears to viewers worldwide. Military families everywhere shared the video, recognizing their own experiences of separation and reunion in the touching scene. What made these stories even more remarkable was the response from the British military and the royal household. Rather than condemning the guards for their actions, official statements praised them for their judgment and humanity. A spokesperson explained that while discipline and protocol were essential parts of military service, the ability to respond appropriately to genuine human need was equally important. The guards themselves became reluctant celebrities, though they remained humble about their actions. In interviews granted after their shifts ended, each of them expressed that they had simply done what felt right in the moment. They emphasized that their actions had been motivated by basic human compassion rather than any desire for attention or recognition. Sergeant Mitchell spoke about how Emma's innocent persistence had reminded him of his own daughter, and that sometimes the most important part of serving others was recognizing when rigid rules needed to give way to human kindness. He kept Emma's drawing in his locker and said it served as a daily reminder of why he chose to serve. Corporal Hayes reflected on how the veteran's salute had connected him to the long tradition of military service and sacrifice. He spoke about the honor he felt in being recognized by someone who had served his country with distinction decades earlier, and how that moment had deepened his own understanding of what it meant to wear the uniform. Lance Corporal Wright shared how his experience with Sarah and Miguel had reminded him of the importance of community support for struggling families. He spoke about how his military training had taught him to protect and serve others, and how sometimes that service took forms that weren't covered in any manual or protocol. Guardsman O'Connor discussed how helping the lost Japanese couple had reinforced his belief that true service meant looking beyond oneself to help others in need. He emphasized that while military discipline was crucial, it should never prevent someone from offering basic human assistance to those who were vulnerable or afraid. Guardsman Reed talked about how his decision to help Sophie find her father had been motivated by his friendship with Peter and his understanding of how important family connections were to military personnel. He spoke about the sacrifices that military families made and how communities needed to support them whenever possible. The stories also had a lasting impact on the people who had been helped. Emma continued to draw pictures of guards and sent them regularly to Sergeant Mitchell, who responded with brief thank you notes that became treasured possessions for the little girl. She eventually decided that she wanted to become a soldier herself when she grew up, inspired by the kindness she had experienced. Robert Chen wrote a letter to the British military, expressing his gratitude for the respect he had been shown. He shared copies of the letter with veteran organizations in his home country, and it became part of a larger discussion about the importance of honoring military service across international boundaries. Sarah stayed in touch with other military families she met through the social media response to her story. She became an advocate for support programs for military spouses and children, using her experience to help create resources for families dealing with the challenges of military life. The Tanaka couple sent a traditional Japanese thank you gift to the Palace Guard units, along with a letter expressing their gratitude for the kindness they had been shown during their visit to London. Their story was featured in Japanese media as an example of international goodwill and hospitality. Sophie and her family maintained their connection with the guards, and Peter was eventually able to arrange proper visits where he could spend time with his daughter without the constraints of formal duty. Sophie's card remained in his uniform pocket throughout his service,